we're hearing a blunt warning from Hezbollah as Washington prepares to host something that, until now, many in the region believed was politically impossible: direct senior-level contact between Lebanon and Israel. In a televised address, Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem rejected the idea outright and urged Beirut to stay away. He said, "We refuse negotiations with the Israeli entity." He argued the talks are not only pointless, but illegitimate without a broad internal agreement inside Lebanon. He said these negotiations are futile, and he insisted that any shift from Lebanon's longstanding rejection of direct talks would require national unity that, in his view, does not exist right now. He said these negotiations need a Lebanese consensus, changing the position from no negotiations to direct negotiations, as is being proposed now. He also delivered a final warning aimed at Lebanon's leaders. Asterisk, he said nobody has the right to take Lebanon on this path. H, without internal agreement among its components. And this did not happen. Asterisk, those remarks are landing as bombs continue to fall in Lebanon and as rockets continue to arc toward Israel's north, turning border communities on both sides into a landscape of evacuations, funerals, and raw anger. Against that backdrop, U.S. diplomats are pushing ahead with a meeting in Washington that American officials are describing as the first direct engagement of this kind between the two countries since 1993. The talks are being facilitated by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and bring together Israel's ambassador to the United States and Lebanon's ambassador to the United States, alongside the U.S. envoy to Beirut and other senior American officials. The stated goal, according to the U.S. side, is to discuss long-term security arrangements along Israel's northern border, while also supporting Lebanon's sovereignty and the Lebanese state's ability to assert control over its territory. But then, before any formal agenda is read out, the fight over the meaning of these talks has become almost as intense as the fighting on the ground. For Hezbollah and its supporters, the fear is that dialogue is being used as a lever, an international trap designed to force disarmament and reshape Lebanon's internal balance of power at a moment when the group has been battered militarily and politically. For Israel, the message from the government has been that there is no pathway to calm, no pathway to a ceasefire, and no pathway to normalization unless Hezbollah's military capacity is dismantled and the group is pushed away from the border. In Beirut, protests have erupted, fueled by anger at Israel's air campaign, by mounting civilian losses, and by the perception that Lebanon is being pressured into concessions while under fire. Demonstrators have accused the government of bending to American and Israeli demands. The political temperature has risen so sharply that even traditional allies of Hezbollah have urged their supporters to dial the protests down, wary of chaos in the capital. Lebanon's leadership, meanwhile, is trying to project a careful balance, rejecting normalization under bombardment, while still searching for any diplomatic mechanism that could stop a war that has displaced more than 1 million people and strained a country already buckling under financial collapse and political paralysis. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam has said his government wants the war to end through negotiations, while also insisting that Lebanon's sovereignty must be protected and that decisions of war and peace cannot be outsourced to any armed group. The government's position is also shaped by a wider domestic debate, one that has grown louder since President Joseph Aoun took office in 2015, about bringing all weapons under the authority of the state as part of a national defense strategy, rather than leaving a parallel armed force operating outside formal command. Still, Lebanon on streets are not debating policy memos. They are debating survival. Israeli airstrikes have continued across parts of the country, and the sound of drones and jets has become a daily reality in multiple regions. The Israeli government says it is targeting Hezbollah infrastructure and fighters, and it argues that Hezbollah has embedded itself among civilians and inside communities, turning the population into human shields. That framing is central to how Israel is defending its campaign internationally, and it was echoed again in the latest Israeli statements, which point the finger at Hezbollah as the reason the war will not stop. An Israeli government spokeswoman laid out what Israel says the dialogue is actually about: not borders, not limited de-escalation, and not a mutual ceasefire, but dismantling Hezbollah's arsenal and removing the group's presence in the south. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also reinforced that line, arguing Israel wants a lasting peace. But only after Hezbollah is neutralized and Israel's northern communities can return home with security guarantees that Israel considers real. Netanyahu has emphasized that Israel's operations are still active and that military pressure will continue while diplomacy is attempted in parallel. This is the contradiction at the heart of the moment. Washington is hosting talks meant to reduce violence, while the battlefield remains fully alive: airstrikes, rocket launches, and ground battles continuing at the same time. One place that has come to symbolize the intensity of this phase is the southern Lebanese town of Bint Jbeil, a strategic hilly area close to the UN demarcated blue line that divides Lebanon and Israel. Fighting there has been described as fierce and sustained, with Israeli forces pushing deeper and Hezbollah attempting to repel them with rockets, artillery, and ambush-style tactics. The clashes have intensified in recent days as Israel accelerates what it calls a ground operation designed to create a buffer zone extending security control several dozen kilometers into Lebanese territory. Israeli officials have suggested such a zone would prevent Hezbollah from reconstituting positions close to the border and would create space for Israeli residents of the north to return. For Lebanon, the idea of a buffer zone is read as something else, a renewed occupation, or at least a long-term military presence that could replicate earlier chapters of this conflict. And analysts are already warning that the trajectory could resemble Israel's approach in Gaza, holding territory and using it as a security perimeter if diplomacy fails. The symbolism of Bint Jbeil is also heavy because of the town's association with Hezbollah's narrative of resistance. It has been a place where the group has historically projected defiance and claimed victory against Israeli forces. Now, with Israeli troops pressing toward encirclement and Hezbollah fighting to prevent a decisive breakthrough, the town is once again a focal point of propaganda, pain, and strategic calculation. Israel has announced another military loss in the fighting there. The Israel Defense Forces said a reservist, Staff Sergeant Ayel Uriel Bianco, 30, was killed during combat in southern Lebanon. Israeli reports described him as a driver of a firefighting vehicle attached to the 180th Brigade. The IDF said other reservists were wounded in the same incident, underscoring the risk Israel's forces are taking as they move through contested terrain under rocket fire. On the Lebanese side, the health ministry has said the death toll has climbed past 2,000 since the war began, including hundreds of women and children, as well as medical workers. Those numbers have become central to Lebanon's case that the campaign is not a narrow counterterrorism operation, but a war with devastating consequences for civilians and for essential services. Among the dead, Lebanese officials and colleagues have highlighted the case of a paramedic, Hassan Badawi, who was killed in what they say was an Israeli drone strike that hit an ambulance. Colleagues said he had arrived at the site of an earlier strike to assist the wounded, had pulled out a stretcher, and was killed on the spot. The incident has fueled anger inside Lebanon and renewed calls from humanitarian groups for stronger protections for medical personnel and emergency responders. As the fighting escalates, the United Nations is trying to keep diplomatic oxygen flowing, pointing both parties back to a framework that has existed for 2 decades but has repeatedly failed to prevent war. Security Council Resolution 1701, adopted after the 2006 conflict. UN officials have urged Lebanon and Israel to use every available diplomatic avenue to end hostilities and address unresolved obligations under that resolution, particularly the question of armed presence and weapons south of the Litani River, and the role of the Lebanese state and international monitors in maintaining stability. UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, remains on the ground in the middle of the conflict, attempting to support deconfliction, civilian protection, and humanitarian access where possible. But UNIFIL has also reported a series of dangerous incidents, rocket fire and airstrikes in its area of operations, as well as obstruction and aggressive behavior that has hindered movement. In recent days, UN officials have described incidents in which Israeli forces attempted to block a UN convoy before it was allowed to proceed, and another incident in which warning shots were fired near a UNIFIL position. UNIFIL also reported that an IDF tank rammed a UNIFIL vehicle near Shama in 2 separate incidents, raising alarm inside the UN system and prompting renewed reminders that all sides are obligated to protect peacekeepers and respect UN facilities. Those incidents matter not only because of the immediate danger, but because they high NT at how compressed and volatile the operating environment has become. When peacekeepers cannot move safely, it becomes harder to prevent miscalculation. When humanitarian corridors are uncertain, civilian suffering increases, and when each side believes the other is trying to change facts on the ground before diplomacy can catch up, the incentives tilt toward escalation. The current round of fighting began on March 2nd, 2026, 2 days after the United States and Israel launched military action against Iran, triggering a broader regional shockwave. Hezbollah entered the conflict by firing across the border into Israel. Israel responded with intensified airstrikes and an expanding ground campaign inside Lebanon. That linkage between the Iran war, the Northern Front, and broader questions of regional deterrence has shaped nearly every political decision since. Now, as Washington tries to broker a channel between Lebanon and Israel, American officials are also managing the consequences. of their confrontation with Iran, with the risk that moves on one front will ignite another. In other words, these talks are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening in a region where alliances, proxies, and rivalries are tightly wound and where local wars rarely stay local for long. In Israel, domestic politics are also pulling the war forward. Polling published by the Israel Democracy Institute indicates strong public backing, particularly among Jewish Israelis, for continuing military operations against Hezbollah, even amid international pressure and even with broader regional dynamics shifting after the Iran confrontation. That public sentiment gives Israel's leadership room to sustain the campaign, and it raises the bar for any deal that could be sold as protecting the North without looking like capitulation. In Lebanon, the political dynamic is the opposite. The state is weaker, public opinion is fractured, and pressure is rising from multiple directions at once. Hezbollah rejecting negotiations, protesters denouncing the government, communities suffering under bombardment, and international actors demanding state authority and reforms. President Joseph Aoun has tried to chart a middle path, expressing hope that the Washington discussions could open a door to a ceasefire and eventually to a more formal diplomatic process. But even optimistic voices are acknowledging that expectations are low. The gap between the stated Israeli objective disarmament and removal of Hezbollah and the Lebanese demand for an end to attacks and respect for sovereignty is vast. That gap is precisely what Washington is now trying to bridge. U.S. officials want to support Israel's security demands while also maintaining Lebanon's territorial integrity and preventing the collapse of a state that is already under enormous strain. Yet the reality is that these talks are opening with maximalist positions on all sides and with bullets still flying. Hezbollah is signaling it with LL not recognize any agreements produced by a process it rejects, and it is framing the meeting as illegitimate. Israel is insisting it will not trade military pressure for mere promises, and it is pushing for outcomes centered on Hezbollah's dismantlement. Lebanon's government is caught in between, trying to keep the state intact and the public together, even as the war tests every institution and every fault line. So Washington is hosting a moment that looks historic on paper, direct, high-level contact after decades of no official face-to-face engagement. But on the ground, nothing is slowing down yet, especially not in places like Bint Jbeil, where the battle is still raging and where the next hours can reshape the next months. Diplomacy is beginning. But for now, the war is still writing the story.